Hello, today is Wednesday, July 17th, 2019. This is the standard Cluster API office hours. If folks could add their details to the agenda, that would be highly useful. I will share my screen and start walking through the agenda. So as always, we have a standard code of conduct policy. Because this meeting is so large, we highly recommend that folks use the raise hand feature. So if you're unfamiliar with that, there's a little bit of documentation at the top, which is underneath the participants section. Starting to walk through the agenda. If you could add your details here, it would be highly useful. Jason, you're up first.
Yes, we're in the process of cutting a 0.1.7 release that includes one bug fix. The release binaries have been created and the image is in the staging repo. I'm working through an issue with the K8s team for publishing the image using the image promoter. There was an issue with the placeholder job that promotes it. I should have that sorted out within the next few hours, and then that release will be live.
Any questions there? If you're not talking, I ask you to please mute. I've been walking through the backlog of people. Questions going once, twice, 3 times. Next up, Andy, face-to-face meeting survey.
Yes, thanks, Tim. I pasted a link into the document if you didn't see it from the email or Slack posts yesterday. We have a survey up for our proposed face-to-face meeting that we're thinking we'll probably do in September. And again, this is for V1 Alpha 3 planning. And we're thinking we need an agenda. So I think most likely it's going to be what's in and out of scope for V1 Alpha 3, plus for the things that are in scope, trying to put together a design, or at least an initial design for those. I'm guessing that we'll probably need a day and a half to 2 days to try and keep travel to a minimum and budgets fairly tight. But please fill out the survey if you haven't had a chance, and then later this week or early next week, we'll work on next steps for solidifying a date and trying to get a location nailed down as well.
Any questions, comments, complaints, concerns for Andy? Going once, twice, 3 times. Next up, Ace, I saw that you were on the call. I know that you had wanted to walk through your proposal or sort of get some more broader feedback. Did you want to do that today?
Yeah, sure. I can just talk or pull it up, or I don't know how you want to do it.
Hold on. If you have a link, if you
Yeah,
want to paste it to me.
Send it to you. I'm just gonna drop it in the chat.
This one here, CAPI fault tolerance.
Yeah, there you go. Cool. Yeah, so I kind of just wanted to start a conversation about this because once you have a cluster, you very likely have some availability requirements around that, and a big part of that is availability zones, or other, whatever your failure domain terminology might be for a given infrastructure provider. This is obviously not the first time in the Kubernetes community this has come up. There is sort of some support for zones and regions built into kind of core itself, but there is not really, in the cluster API community, a consistent way, at least, to provision clusters that are either resilient to failures in single domains, that clusters that have their control plane spread across domains, or that to specify, hey, give me everything in one domain, and let cluster API kind of take care of it. There are some implementations in AWS, I know, in the cabin provider. You can specify an AZ and basically get all your resources there. And there's sort of a little bit of something similar. You can get a random AZ basically for CabZ. So there's a lot of words here. I think the proposal basically boils down to, I would like some way for us to specify the behavior and for users to get consistent behavior. in terms of the way that their cluster resources like VMs are spread across these domains. I think the absolute simplest possible proposal is either they're redundant or they're not. And if they are redundant, the gist would be you should spread them across all the possible AZs. And if they're not, then you should ideally isolate them all to a single AZ. That is a very kind of simple initial proposal. I think there are some complex alternatives that we can explore. Yeah, sure.
So first question, it seems highly, I see Justin has his hand raised. I'll go really quick. It seems highly provider specific and fragmented across providers. Justin, did you want to go?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify when we're talking about, I think there's a difference between the control plane and the machine deployments. And I think to date, what we have said, not very formally, but what we have sort of said is a machine deployment would be sort of per zone or whatever your like most localized failure domain is. So that it better integrates with things like auto scaling and that sort of thing. And so, for example, you would typically have 3 machine deployments in a HA, like 3 zonal configuration. I don't know if that helps, and certainly it does not, it glosses over like the control plane.
Yeah, I was actually just gonna say, I mean, for the control plane scenario, right, like you would need an HA, potentially an HA control plane with still 3 machine deployments, so you would need to be aware of that information, even if you're saying that that's the way that users should go forward, right? And that also makes another point. You need to be aware of that information, in fact, at the level of machine set or machine deployment, not at the cluster level, to even have a story there, right?
So I guess the question here is like, I agree with the supposition. I think it's highly fragmented and the language of the terms we would want to use would vary. And there would also be a question of what's the importance level of machines versus control plane. I think control plane, as Justin mentioned earlier, is obviously of higher importance for most consumers who care about some level of fault tolerance. They're going to care about machines too, but then you take away the capabilities for, as Justin mentioned, like auto scaling groups. I don't exactly know how to solve this one other than like, if a provider wants to implement an example and potentially propagate that back to the core, that seems like a reasonable, show this as an example, show how it's common across providers, and then go forth from there. Andrew, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I agree with everything you said, Tim. I wanted to add, CAPV is looking at doing some affinity, anti-affinity rules that might fall under the aegis of the fault tolerance. But because fault tolerance can act, while it routinely might imply something like HA through the use of load balancers, and so I would call that network fault tolerance, right? You could still, with something like vSphere, have VM fault tolerance through something as the DRS feature. So I want to make sure that we have to recognize there are different types of fault tolerance, and it can't be strictly related back to network-based fault tolerance or high availability. That was it.
Go ahead, Ace.
So yeah, I hear kind of a couple concerns, I guess. In terms of proof of concept, I can definitely kind of take a stab at something and come back. I think in terms of provider-specific details, my goal is kind of to define how this would work at the Kubernetes node level, right, at the machine deployment level. And then, it's up to the providers to implement what those details look like. But there are some behaviors that kind of a user should expect in terms of, hey, my control plane is maybe HA or maybe not. My machine deployments are isolated to an AZ or a fault domain, or they're not. Those are things that, as a user of Cluster API, I would need to at least know or have the information exposed so that I can build higher level orchestration myself if I needed to.
I think there already exists semantics for doing some of this currently inside of Kubernetes proper itself through the use of labels and anti-affinity rules. Like so long as you have the capability to have attach anti-affinity rules, like who was mentioning that earlier? Was that Justin? That you can have that capability built in under the hood behind the scenes, and I think that's a reasonably generic way to approach this problem without inventing new verbs and nouns.
Okay, that's fair. I mean, I think part of the reason I was bringing it here is that this is something that in core, right, like in say cloud provider, they're trying to push out of core, and this is very much like an infrastructure-aware place that is provisioning these machines. So it seemed like kind of a nice niche that actually might fit well in terms of the provider specificity, in terms of something that we're already dealing with. But I definitely understand that concern.
Yeah. So I think I don't. We'd have to modify some of the things, some of the resource objects to have. The current scheduling has a bunch of rules around affinity and anti-affinity and soft versus hard. And we'd have to basically nail down what was the set of things. I think if you do it within that, with that context in mind, you might be able to solve your problem in a reasonable way and get a subset of that total steering apparatus that exists inside of scheduling. That's my hot take. I'm open to other suggestions or ideas as well.
Okay, yeah, maybe I'll just poke around and see what I can run with. And maybe we won't do this at all. We'll see.
Are there any other questions, comments, complaints, concerns? Gotta scroll back up to the top. Next topic is Andy, talk about Pablo's proposal.
Yes, I just wanted to bring this up again since I don't think that there's any contentious comments in there. I know we were waiting on a diagram update from ASCII Art to Plant UML, and there maybe were like one or two other small edits. But if you haven't had a chance to look at this proposal, please do. We're highly motivated to get this approved so that it can go into V1 Alpha 2 because it'll allow us to get rid of the actuator interface from the cluster entirely. So Pablo, do you have anything else you want to add about it?
No. I mean, I think that in terms of changes, there is only one left that you made yesterday, and then I will update the diagrams. And besides the fact that I look really retro, I think the diagram itself, I think there are no changes, structural changes. So I think that people can take a look at what is there right now, and it will still make sense.
Okay, so in terms of timing, I'd say, I actually don't remember when you opened the PR on this one, but it's been out there at least a week. Thanks, Tim. Yeah, so I would say, maybe by Friday we could lazy consensus merge it if there's nothing else contentious. Does that sound reasonable?
Sounds good to me, unless anyone else, if there are dissenters, speak now or forever hold your peace.
All right, well, we'll keep track over the next couple of days. And thank you, Pablo, again, for putting that together.
Welcome.
All right, next up, Cecile, the CAPC VMSS proposal.
Hi, so I'm Cecile for those I haven't met yet. So thank you for everyone who already looked at the doc, and thank you for your comments. I think we were mostly looking for guidance at this point on how we should proceed. There seems to be two things that mostly came up after the doc review. The first one is how this virtual machine scale set implementation differs from Kubernetes auto-scaling concepts. And so I think we do agree that there's some overlap there. And unfortunately, that's just because the way they implemented the scale sets in Azure, it does do some things like auto scaling, but we do want to use the Kubernetes primitives for sure. Even though there's some features such as like reimaging, for example, that using the VMSS infrastructure allows us to do, but that we can't do with loose VMs. So that was the primary motivation for this proposal. And then in terms of like whether we want to do this in the cluster API, Azure provider, and do this specifically for Azure, I would really like to see this be shared across providers. If we can make it in a way that's generic enough so that we can reuse this and it's not VMSS Azure specific. The reason that we started this proposal here was I was at least under the impression that there had been the question in the past, and sorry if I'm missing some context here, but the question of extending machine sets in Cluster API had been brought up in the past, and that wasn't really something that we wanted to go for. So this proposal is kind of showing an idea of how we would do about implementing scale sets without being able to extend the machine sets or an equivalent in Cluster API. But totally open to that option if that's back on the table as well. So yeah.
This has got to have comments. I'll just call people. Justin, you have to have a comment on this.
I absolutely, yes. I have not yet had a chance to review the proposal. I apologize. I think I was certainly one of the people that, I don't think there's consensus on this, but I am one of the people, I think, in the camp that says we should not back machine sets with MIGs, ASGs, or I guess VMSS. My objection being the idea that we want to have consistent behavior regardless of how we are backing the machine set. And that will be particularly difficult to achieve if we essentially delegate most of the behavior to an API over which we have zero or much less control in terms of because it's defined by the cloud providers. And I concretely, I worry that at some stage we will define a conformance test or something akin to a conformance test, and it will be difficult, if not impossible, to conform to that conformance test on like an auto-scaling group-backed implementation. And we have seen challenges where, for example, on AWS with their fleet, their new sort of fleet behavior, that doesn't, it's difficult to, there are some conflicts with how Kubernetes thinks about these things, and like the autoscaler and about like rolling updates, and they sort of battle each other in ways that are sort of surprising. And so we're starting to see some of these problems already on the AWS side because of leveraging autoscaling groups instead of having a machine set directly create machines, which then goes and creates, or create machine CRD objects, which then goes and creates machines on a one-to-one basis.
In order, it was Jason, then Cecile. I don't know if Cecile, you wanted to comment on that before going to Jason.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, that'd be great. So this is Wanli. So I just want to add that I want to make sure that when we talk about Azure and VMSS as it pertains to the provider here, the scale functionality is not something that we'll use. So the automatic scale, that will just be turned off. The primary motivation behind us, wanting to use to be able to back these machines by this Azure VMSS is really, this is the state of the art in terms of our, virtual machine management right now in Azure. And any of the new features that are coming out for Azure, a lot of them require or have more desirable functionality when you're using these, VM scale sets versus just standalone VMs or even some of the older iterations there. And so it's not I just want to make sure that we understand that we don't want to have different auto scaling compete. The goal for what we would try to implement is really that we would defer to Kubernetes to control auto scaling, and we would really just be using this VMSS to allocate VMs out of. So that's one thing. And then just the last thing I'll add is the document really outlines how the implementation would look given Cluster API as it lives today. And I think we've gotten various feedback on overriding machine set or hooks and things like that. And really with the changes that are happening in Cluster API, we're looking a little bit for guidance on the patterns are changing, and what is the right we want to make the developer we want to help make the developer experience good for for other providers that are facing similar challenges. And given the state of the art in terms of the patterns you guys are using, that's really what we're looking for here. And really what's captured in the document again is it demonstrates how we would do it now given the abstractions that are there. And it's not really intended to be the solution.
Jason, then Vince.
Yep. So the first concern that I would have would be around control plane node management right now, because that can't easily be abstracted away into like a set of instances that have the same type of template, specifically around the need to init the first one versus join. And it almost seems like that one's still, that use case, at least today, still needs to be handled by like individually backed instances backed by machine or abstracted by machines as we start to formalize the management of that. The other thing too is I was originally a proponent or in favor of extending machine sets to support this type of functionality, but I've been persuaded otherwise for a few different reasons. But I think we should have some type of primitive that we support in Cluster API itself for providers to be able to back resources by something similar to VMSS or autoscaling groups or whatnot, and that way the user can decide how they want their instances backed.
Vince, then Justin.
Mostly echoing what Jason said. I wanted to add, I would like to see a higher level object in Cluster API that does this, but it's tightly scoped. So, for example, definitely have contracts of not using this for nothing else other than worker nodes, so no control planes, etc. But yeah, it's still an open question, how does this fit into Cluster API as a whole? But I think we can work towards something like that.
Justin, then Cecile.
I have scanned through the design doc, and it looks like you are proposing something which is actually I think a great design. It's the one that I think might work in terms of how can you actually square the circle and be compatible. So to summarize, it looks like you are saying we will still create the Kubernetes machine objects, but we will aggregate those creations, similar creations, into mutations on a VMSS rather than individually actuating them as create instance calls or the equivalent. And that to me, I think makes sense and can work. I think there are challenges around naming, but to me, if that is what you're proposing, to me, that is the design that can work in Cluster API. And if that is what you're proposing, I would love to see that. I think that makes sense. It may be that we find it doesn't work, but I think it is the one that to me makes sense, if that's what is being proposed, if I understood correctly.
Cecile?
Yeah, so, and just to fill in the blanks for your skim, I think one of the one of the ugly things that come along with that design, and maybe this is the thing that we address in as part of a really tight scope, is let's say as part of a machine deployment you create you want to create 10 machines. So if we handle this with normal controllers, I'll go and make the I see, oh, I need a new machine out of this machine set. I'll increment the replica count by 1, and then I'll somehow track that the Azure provisioning to make sure that it completes. Now I'll and go away, right? And then I'll get another notification, right, from another for this other machine, and really what that means is I want to ahead of time be able to say, okay, machine set, give me 10 machines, and then as part of in this design, what we'll do is we'll have something to kind of track, a bunch of these requests that are coming in at the same time, batch them up together in a single call to BMSS, and then work around that. But I think it would be a little bit nicer. It would feel a little cleaner if we had a way to kind of ahead of time say, oh, okay, this machine deployment is requesting 10 machines at once. Let me go get ahead of that, and then as part of those machine CRDs being processed, it knows that it's associated with some machine set as part of a reference, and then all of these instances can wait on that machine set to complete.
Michael, then Justin.
So the pattern that you just described actually might be a pretty good fit for what we did in the bare metal actuator. It's probably not worth trying to dig through the weeds and describe how those might actually be similar, and we might be able to reuse that pattern for your use case. But I'd be interested to maybe follow up after this call if you'd be interested to brainstorm about that a little bit.
Justin?
I was just going to say, yes, I absolutely agree. That is how you take these independent threads or Go routines and merge them into one is indeed a challenge. I think though that that's a good challenge, because that's something we can solve once and we can figure out the strategy for doing that. And it is not a user facing thing. And I think if that's the worst, then we're in good shape. The ones that I know are naming is the one that I think is more challenging. On AWS, for example, I don't think you can control there's no such thing as a name, but on GCE MIGs, it's not obvious how you get an instance that comes up with a name that matches the name of the machine. And I don't know if VMSS has a similar or has a functionality to do that, but I do think we can figure out a strategy for making that work. And I think that could be shared. And so to me, that is a good problem and not because it's one that it's within our scope, and we can solve it together. And yeah, there may be things from bare metal or other areas, and we can figure it out. But I don't see that as a real blocker.
Yeah, just real quick, the naming is rigid, just like AWS, so that is a problem.
That's one of the challenges I think we outlined in the document.
So it sounds to me like we need a little bit more of a thorough read through for people who are interested to try and go through the fiddly details and see if we can abstract some of the behaviors or not. It sounds, just on a hot take, it sounds like the approach you've taken is solid. I question whether or not we can change some behavior in machine sets so that way your batching becomes automatic, so that way you don't have to do a separate sort of batching by yourself, and this way it could potentially support that capability across providers. But I'd have to, as well as I think others, have to read through a little bit more. Vince?
I was just wondering, I have a question, do we want to work on this for V1 Alpha 2, and do you folks have time to work on a proposal for V1 Alpha 2 that we can spec this, or V1 Alpha 3 for that matter, if there's not enough time? Just wondering how many people do we have behind this?
is this question for Cecile and I?
Yes.
So you mean by V1 Alpha 2, you mean like that would be the cluster API implementation, right? Not the Azure provider implementation.
Correct. Yeah.
So that would be assuming we're not following the doc, the design proposal.
I'm saying like if we want to take this methodology of implementing cloud provider autoscaling groups into cluster API, could we do this in V1 Alpha 2, or do we want to backport that in V1 Alpha 1? Although I'm wary of like this is like a much bigger feature in V1 Alpha 1 from a cluster API perspective. From CapZ perspective, like I guess that this is okay, but given that V1 Alpha 2 is like a month and a half away, it might make sense to like work in that direction, and I'm happy to help. Just was wondering like if you folks were interested as well.
I think for us, that's a month and a half is a pretty tight timeline. So I think you know we also don't want to rush ahead too quickly. I think I'm not totally caught up on what's planned for V1 Alpha 2 versus V1 Alpha 3. But I would prefer we kind of we target V1 Alpha 3 with this, and in the meantime, you know, we can implement this. If the proposal is you know, seems sound, we can implement it without any of the you know, goodness, and then as an exercise for V1 Alpha 3, we use that as the starting point and really demonstrate how we can, you know, delete the code that we think is ugly and then replace that with something nice.
You pretty much read my mind there. I think that's probably a more, I don't want to overload V1 Alpha 2 as it currently exists today, because we already just added a bunch of features with some of the, with Pablo's proposal. Now that's not to mean that people can't work async on POCs, but if we want to abstract it back into CAPI and the possible implementations that would inherit from there, that's a much bigger change. So I love the idea. Folks, read the proposal, try to collect feedback and comments. If you want to work on a POC, that's great. Highly recommend leveraging V1 Alpha 2 for your POC, and then potentially try to abstract and talk about this, maybe even in a face-to-face meeting if we get that details hammered out for V1 Alpha 3.
Sounds great to me.
Does that seem reasonable to you, Cecile? And I forgot who was the other person there.
Yeah, that sounds perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
So again, please read over the proposal and try to give feedback. That'd be highly useful. Are there any other last questions, comments, complaints, concerns on the VMSS proposal? Come once, twice, 3 times. All right, I will stop sharing my screen and I will let Andy go through the new issues.
Thank you, Tim. Give me just a second to get this open. We don't have many. I think it's just 3. So the first one here is from Vince. Publish images from master after each merge. So Chuck, are you on the call?
Yes.
So I know you did this for CapD to at least be able to use the GitHub Actions to publish to the GitHub package registry for Docker, right?
Yeah, that's still, GitHub packages are still a fairly new feature. I wouldn't necessarily recommend using them at this time, especially for releases at least.
So
yeah.
Jason, with the work you've been doing with Image Promoter, do you know of any way that we could automate building and tagging and pushing the master images to the staging repository, or does that still require, could we hook it into Prow or something?
So I think we have 2 options. We can probably relatively easily automate it today using GitHub Actions, but I would rather us wire it into Prow with the rest of the automation configuration right now. And what we basically need to do there is sync with somebody you know, like Catherine or Aaron, and try to get a secret mounted that would have permission to push to the proper staging repo, and then we could automate pushing an image on build.
Okay. So Jason, I know you've done a lot in this area, but you're also fairly heavily loaded. I'm happy to let you take this if you want, but I think this also could be an opportunity for someone else to get some experience with the test infrastructure and secrets and building and pushing images. So I'll leave it up to you if you want to take this or if you want to put help wanted on here.
I think we can go ahead and put help wanted on there, and if I get to it before somebody steps up, then so be it.
Okay. I quickly put next on here, but yes.
Sorry to jump in. I was going to say, if someone wants help with that, that's something I might be able to help with as well. I'm working on, we do this already, pushing images from master from Prow for both Cat V and a couple other vSphere related projects. So I definitely have experience with that.
Okay. Do you want to take this one?
I admit I wasn't paying close attention to what was going on, but sure, since I'm already doing it for other projects.
Okay. What's your GitHub nick?
Coden Roden, C-O-D-E-N.
Okay.
Yep.
Thanks, Travis. And I'm just going to put this in V1 Alpha 2 because if you're already doing this, we probably can get this done pretty quickly. Okay. Next up is from Daniel. Bootstrap cluster cleaned up despite failed pivot. So, Daniel, are you on the call?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to walk us through this one?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. The short of it is that I spun up a cluster with Kappa, so on AWS with Cluster Cuddle, and I had you know, I had I think misconfigured some, I think maybe the name of the SSH key. In any case, so Cluster Cuddle created the Bootstrap cluster, then proceeded, you know, the control plane proceeded to create the, you know, the initial cluster nodes on AWS, and then it tried to pivot, and then it failed, I think, because it couldn't get the I couldn't get, you know, the kube config from the workload cluster, so it couldn't do the pivot, obviously, because it couldn't talk to that API, and then it errored out and quit. But as part of quitting, it cleaned up the Bootstrap cluster. So then I no longer had the objects or the resources that describe that workload cluster anywhere. So that state was gone. So at that point, I had to go to AWS and clean up those resources on my own, or at least that was sort of the quickest option. So I thought that if something fails along the way, that let's not by default destroy the Bootstrap cluster, you know, destroy the resources that destroy the Kubernetes objects or the CAPI objects that describe some resources that have already been deployed. Just to have that, it's good to have that state around in case you need to, you know, start from the middle, or maybe delete those resources using
okay.
Control.
That makes sense. Thank you for the description. Tim, I gave this the Cluster Cuddle label. Do you want to take this one, or do you think that this is enough of a bug that we should try and address it sooner rather than later?
I put a help wanted on it. I am not going to take bugs for Cluster Cuddle. I have an approach, but I'm vetting some details maybe to share by either next week or the week after on a different approach.
Okay. In terms of milestone, given that we don't currently have an assignee, I think I don't know, I'm torn on this one.
I'm happy to take it,
Daniel.
If the solution is, if it's not like controversial, you know, if it's just if we recognize that there's an actual bug, I think it's a quick fix.
Okay, we can put it in the milestone. I think probably, since you noted that it's in a defer call, we probably can adjust the logic to check the errors and don't clean up the Bootstrap cluster if there's an error. So I don't think that would be too controversial, hopefully. Okay, the last one we have, let me just refresh real quick, is update Lodash, which I've got 2 open PRs for this, one for master and one for release 0.1. So I will say that I did it without really knowing what I was doing in terms of NPM. So those of you who do understand this better than I do, please review my PRs and see if I did it correctly, and I'd be happy to fix it if not. All right, anybody have any other issues or things that they want to talk about? Oh, I think I saw Dustin had
has a PSA on the.
Yeah, it's not about this topic, but yes, I normally get asked how the Kappa accounts are coming. I managed to create our first Kappa account, and I think it is all looking good. So I'm going to go and create some others. It is a slightly manual process, but I think I have got all our ducks in a row. We have a Google group that is fairly locked down. We can create AWS sub, whatever they are, accounts that are part of a bigger organization. So I am working through that process.
That is good news. Thank you.
I'll get there, I promise.
Are there any last topics while everyone is here? Going once, I'll call them slowly because everyone stops me at 2. Going twice. Go 3 times. All right, so we'll call it a call. Happy July 17th, everyone. Have a good day.